Welcome back again to our online lectures of macroeconomics. In our previous lectures, or series of lectures, we introduced GDP, gross domestic product, and then we talked about how we measure GDP, why we measure GDP. Then we talked about the difference between real GDP and nominal GDP, right? And now that we understand how we measure economic activity, we're going to be talking about economic growth and why economic growth is important. So here we have our good old friend, the production possibilities curves. This is a review from something we learned way back in chapter 1. It's one of the basic economic models and one of the most important building block of economic ideas. So, a quick review here. Capital goods on the vertical axis. Remember, capital goods are things like machines and equipment and tools and factories. All right, and capital goods satisfy economic wants indirectly and over time. So that's on your vertical axis there. And on your horizontal axis is consumer goods. Consumer goods satisfy economic wants directly and immediately. Now, typically we need some of both. We know we need some capital goods and consumer goods. So anywhere along our green production possibility frontier, we would be achieving full employment. We'd be at society's potential economic output. So we would be using all of our available resources in an efficient manner. So we would be doing the best with the least, so to speak. And the green curve for now represents our limitations of production. But we said that in the future we could achieve economic growth through a couple different reasons. The first one being an improvement in the quantity or quality of resources. So if we discover more resources or we get better resources, that would lead to economic growth. And then the second cause of economic growth would be an improvement in technology / productivity, right? So a new methodology, some new computer system, some better way or fandangled system of producing goods and services, right? And either one of those would shift the curve from our current curve out to our new curve here, right? So that would be our sources of economic growth, right? And in general, productivity / technology is far more important. Most economic growth, something like 2/3 of economic growth, can be attributed to increases in productivity and increases in technology. So, okay, well, how do we measure economic growth, and why is economic growth? And that's what we're going to be talking about here, right? Well, first of all, why is economic growth important? Well, economic growth is important because it reduces the burden of scarcity. Remember, when we defined economics in the beginning of the course, we said economics was a social science concerned with the maximum production of goods and services with society's limited or scarce resources. So how can we maximize the satisfaction of human beings, knowing that our land, capital, labor, and entrepreneurability for the time being is fixed? So it's like, doing the best with the least, so to speak. So if we achieve economic growth, if we produce more goods in the future than we did in the current period, then it definitely lessens the burden of scarcity, right? And in broadest terms, it increases the standard of living, right? People are just better off. So that's why economic growth is important. That's why economic growth is important. So there are two ways to measure economic growth. There are two ways to measure economic growth. The first one is something we went over in a previous lecture, but it's worth going over again. Real GDP. So if real GDP increases over time, we know that the economy is definitely growing, because what we're saying there is that after we've adjusted for changes in the price level, the economy has grown, and typically the economy grows somewhere between 2.5% and 3%. So that's our typical growth rate for the U.S. economy, right? And then the other way to measure economic growth is through real per capita GDP, or real GDP per capita, right? Now, what does that mean? How do we get that number? Real GDP per capita is a simple idea. It's simply to say, okay, we simply take a nation's population divided by a nation's GDP divided by its population. So, for instance, in 2011, U.S. economic output was roughly $15 trillion, and there's roughly 310 million Americans living here in the United States. So per capita GDP is simply gross domestic product divided by population, right? So basically, how much does each person share in the economic output of a country? Now, I wouldn't expect you to crank out your calculators and do the math. Thank goodness we have people that do that for us. This comes out to roughly $46,000 per person in the United States in 2011, right? So in other words, U.S. real GDP, right? Real GDP per capita was about $46,000. So if we took our real GDP of $15 trillion and we divided it by the U.S. population of 310 million, we say it's roughly $46,000 per person. Well, before we go any further, let's talk about how that compares to other countries. Well, we said that, we looked at some of the top economic engines of the world. We mentioned the U.S., right? China is now number 2, Japan is number 3, and Germany is number 4. All right, well, in Germany, per capita GDP works out to be something near $37,000 per person. So Germany has the 4th largest economy in the world, and their per capita GDP, real GDP per capita, is about $37,000 per person. Now we said that last year China surpassed Japan. China surpassed Japan as the world's 2nd largest economic engine, 2nd largest economic entity on earth. But there are a lot of people who live in China, right? So per capita GDP, right, real GDP per capita in China is only $8,100, right? So even though their total economic output is larger than Japan and Germany and many other countries, you say, where would you rather live, right? Now, one quick aside, and I wouldn't expect you to know this for a test or quiz, but it's worth mentioning because some of the more astute students might say something like, well, goods and services cost less than China, so you wouldn't need as much money. Well, when statisticians and economists, when they measure real GDP per capita, they use an idea called purchasing power parity. This is something you would definitely come across in a finance class. Purchasing power parity. In other words, what if we adjust for the difference in costs of goods and services in different countries? So that's already been accounted for when we come up with that number of real GDP per capita, right? Okay. Now, is the percentage rate of growth? I just said that on average, or the long run average for the United States from say 1960 through 2010 is about 2.5–3% economic growth. That's our average real GDP growth rate over that time, right? Well, does it matter? Does it matter if we have a higher growth rate? What's the economic consequences of just a little bit lower growth rate? Well, you may have heard of this in a math class, maybe even a science classes. This idea of the rule 70, right, can also definitely be used in a finance class. Right, sometimes called the rule 72. Right, so it could be stated either way. But here's what the rule 70 states: if you know the percentage change in any variable, right, you take that percentage change and you divide it into 70, right? And that'll take you how long. That'll tell you how long it'll take that variable to double. So for instance, let me give you a non-economic example. So let's say that it's currently 50 degrees in my room here, and where I'm lecturing, right? It's currently 50 degrees, and let's say it's getting 10% hotter every 7 minutes, right? It's getting 10% hotter every 7 minutes, right? Well, we take the 70, right, divide it by the rate of change, and I said 10%, so 70 divided by 10 is 7, right? So in 7 periods, right, in 7 periods, or 7 times our other 7, in roughly 49 minutes, it'll be 100 degrees in here, right? That's the way it works. This is also applicable for people who are trying to save for retirement. Financial analysts and financial planners will often say, let's assume we have a growth rate for your portfolio of something like 7 or 8% on average. Well, if you save at such and such a rate, how long will it take you to get to your goal, right? So we can guesstimate pretty accurately how long it'll take for your portfolio to reach a certain level based on an assumed growth rate for your portfolio. Now, for an economist, right, it's a straightforward proposal. If we take the growth rate of real GDP, right, And we say, okay, what's 70 divided by that economic growth rate? That'll tell us roughly how long it takes an economy to double its economic output. So let's think about an economy growing at 2% versus an economy growing at 4%. So let's do the easier math one first, right? 70 divided by 2, or 2%. If an economy grows at roughly 2% annually, right, on average, it will take it roughly 35 years. That country will double its economic output in roughly 35 years. If another country with similar resources and population and such is growing just 2% faster at 4%, so if their economic growth rate is roughly 4%, right, look what happens. 70 divided by 4 works out to be 17 and a half years. So the economy growing at 2%, it takes 35 years for the economic output to double, or for GDP to double, right, for real GDP to double. An economy growing at 4%, it only takes 17 and a half years for economic output to double. So now you can see what a powerful idea this is about the Rule 70, and why it's an extremely important idea to measure how much an economy may grow over time. Okay, let's talk about some just basic statistics about what's happened here. Right, since from 1950 to 2005, right, real GDP has increased sixfold. It increases about 3.5% per year over that period. So that 55-year period, our average growth rate was about 3.5% per year, and the economy has increased sixfold. Right, real GDP per capita, right, it's increased more than threefold, and it's about 2.3% per year. So, on average, real GDP per capita increases at about 2.3% per year. Now, these qualifications are some things that we actually mentioned when we talked about some of the shortcomings of GDP, right, as a measuring tool. Remember, right, products and services continue to improve. Right, products and services continue to get better. So even though the economy, we said, okay, it grew sixfold from 1950 to 2005, it actually did better than that if we could somehow mathematically incorporate the improvement in products and services. Right? We also said that we work less as human beings here in the United States. Right? So we've had much more added leisure time, and that's not in the in the numbers there. And finally, the other impacts here is that, okay, well, is this the only way to measure society's well-being? Is real GDP and per capita GDP the only way to measure, the health and well-being of humans living here? Let's look at some of the reasons why economic growth has been so stellar especially here in the United States and other modern industrialized nations who have adopted capitalism as their political scheme, so to speak, right? So here are some of the growth promoting structures that took place. Number one, strong property rights, right? You cannot have capital without, you cannot have capitalism without capital. You cannot have capitalism without capital. So under the system of capitalism, we have private ownership of economic resources. We can't understate how important this idea is to capitalism and to economic well-being. Right? The fact that you have private ownership of economic resources, it fosters two things. Number one, people do not have to waste time trying to defend their rights, because there's clearly defined property rights. If somebody violates my property rights, I can take them to court. And because you own an economic resource, you have incentive to improve it and to use it in an efficient manner. Right? Next one, patents and copyrights. And here's where, one of the huge criticisms levied on China, because we're going to be talking about free trade in a moment, is that China's been violating a lot of U.S. patents and a lot of U.S. copyrights without permission. But, think about it. Whether it's one entrepreneur, a man or a woman, or it's a group of people working for a company, if they invest a great deal of time, energy, and of course, a financial dedication. So, not only are they taking their time and their effort and their energy, they've also made some financial contributions towards researching some type of product. Well, we need to ensure that those people receive the rewards for their efforts. Right? The pharmaceutical industry is a great example of this. Maybe 1 out of every 20 or 30 drugs, pharmaceutical products, actually is a winner for pharmaceutical companies, and they have to absorb the cost of all of those losers. So imagine if they weren't protected by patents or copyrights, right? It would be easy for other chemical manufacturers, for other pharmaceutical producers to steal their ideas. Right? Efficient financial institutions. Right? Efficient financial institutions. This is actually really important. Think about this. Right? Number one, we have a banking system that works extremely well, and people say, why did we bail out these big banks? And we don't have time to go into this in great detail, but let me give you the simplest explanation. A small manufacturing firm who employs, say, 50 to 60 people, has been in business for the last 25 years. Manufacturing firms in general don't have a lot of cash as an asset, because cash doesn't do anything for firms, right? Cash is an asset, but you can't build a product. You can't use cash as a piece of equipment. You can't use it as a tool, as a manufactured aid. So businesses don't like to have, especially small to medium-sized businesses, they don't like to have a lot of their assets tied up in cash. So what they do is they typically operate through the lending institutions on a monthly basis. So they'll borrow money at a very low interest rate and use that money for operating expenses throughout the month, whether that's to buy raw materials and to pay for utilities and to pay for salary. And then as the revenue from the production and sale of their goods and services comes in, they use that revenue to pay back the loan every month. Without a functioning financial institution system, this would be cut off, and the lifeblood of the economy would be cut off. So that's one of the reasons why the Federal Reserve felt it was imperative to rescue or to bail out some of these evildoers. And there's no justifying what they did when you talk about the way they manipulated the financial system. All right, some of these are common sense. Literacy and widespread education. Obviously, that's going to improve economic growth rates. All right, free trade is a big one. Since 1950, a huge decrease in the number of tariffs, in the quotas that are out there, and the non-trade barriers. So we, across the globe, we've really opened up our countries to free trade. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, right? Here up in the United States and Canada and Mexico, we have NAFTA. So all of these trade agreements have definitely increased economic output throughout the globe, because it leads to more efficient use of society's scarce resources based on the economic concept of comparative advantage. That is to say, let the countries who possess a comparative advantage based on the ability to produce a good at a lower domestic opportunity cost, they should produce that good and trade for other goods, right? And the market system, I know it's quite evident now how communism / socialism as an economic model failed, mostly because there were no incentives for individuals and for groups, for businesses to do better.